Welcome to the Tsujimoto Perspectives in Global Development Seminar. I'm Louise Buck. I'm in the Department of Natural Resources and Environment here at Cornell. I'm one of the co-organizers of this seminar series and instructor for those who are taking the seminar for credit. It is my great pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Craig Spencer. Dr. Spencer is a globally recognized emergency medicine physician, and he's an associate professor of the practice at Brown University School of Public Health. He has over 2 decades of experience working in global health and humanitarian responses to global health outbreaks. He has been either a board member and or an advisor of Doctors Without Borders, one of my favorite organizations. I'm really excited to know more about his work with that group. And he frequently shares his writings on global health policy, not only in medical and academic literature, but also in the public sphere. One of his goals is to help raise awareness broadly and policy support for global public health, working in a systems thinking perspective, which I also really appreciate. His talk to us today is entitled Ebola and a Decade of Disparities, Forging a Future for Global Health Equity. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Spencer.
Thank you, Dr. Buck. I want to start by sharing a story about someone named Dr. Sheikh Umar Khan. You may not know him. In fact, I actually never met him. But much of the story that I'm going to tell today relies on him or people like him. And the importance of addressing what may now feel like a dirty word, global health equity, is even more important in this moment. And I hope his story explains why. Dr. Khan is, like me, a physician. He was the head infectious disease doctor in Sierra Leone. In 2014, he was responsible for leading the country's Ebola outbreak activities. He's been considered a national hero and is one of my own heroes. But to understand why Dr. Khan's story is so important for global health equity, I need to take you on a bit of a journey. Now, this may look like a picture of a plane from April 2020 when no one was flying around, but this is actually September of 2014. This is the Brussels airline flight from Belgium to Conakry, the capital of Guinea. If your question is, you are the only 4 people on a plane, will they let you sit in first class if you are booked on an economy fare all the way to the back? The answer is they absolutely will not. Even if what you're doing is working with a group of people that are going to Guinea, going to West Africa to try and treat Ebola cases, which is what I was doing. So I took a flight, ended up in Conakry, the capital, took another flight to a place called Kisidugu, and then took about a 2.5-hour ride along pretty nice roads to this place called Gekadu. If you recall from the 2014 Ebola outbreak, Gekadu was the epicenter. This is where things started when a 2-year-old boy got sick at the end of 2013, and in March of 2014, an Ebola outbreak was identified and declared. Over the summer, the number of cases just increased. And I got there in September of 2014 to provide medical care to Ebola patients at a clinic down this road, just up that hill. I was there with Doctors Without Borders, and at the time, there was exploding cases. It went from 10 to 20 to 30 to 40 to 50, 60, 70, 90 patients that needed care by the time that I left in mid-October. I worked with some of the most impressive and incredible people I've ever met. So Dr. Keita and Dr. Modé These are two Guinean physicians, infectious disease doctors that knew everything about Ebola and taught me everything that I needed to know to take care of Ebola patients. This is just a brief video giving you an idea of what it's like. This is me in the personal protective equipment. And I cut off the first few minutes of this video, but this is just what it was like every single day. The process of going in, taking care of patients, the process of trying to make sure that you were safe, the process of making sure that you didn't infect yourself as you were taking off your personal protective equipment, which is the highest risk time. This is something that we did every single day. There was this person here, his whole job was to make sure I did this correctly. Because after an hour and a half inside an Ebola treatment unit, when it's 90, 95 degrees outside, you've sweat a liter of fluid into your boots, you're not thinking clearly. And so you can't be responsible for taking care of yourself. Someone else needs to be responsible for you as well. After that time, I thought, whew, this is exhausting. It is time for me to go home. Having seen things that I thought I would never see again. But the world had different plans for me. After I got home, I started feeling unwell and found myself spending 19 days in this all-inclusive resort at Bellevue Hospital on the Lower East Side of New York City. Now, I know it looks like incredible quarters, and you're thinking, this is better than Sandals, better than any vacation I've ever got. The windows didn't open, and I wasn't allowed to leave the room. I had a couple visitors every day. I had no TV other than this one up here in the corner, which is actually just a security camera. So I got to see what was happening on like the third floor. They didn't have time to actually hook up the TV connection. And in the end, it actually turned out to be really good. But I had 19 days in this one place where I wasn't able to leave. And I had a lot of time to sit and think. And the things that I thought about were what was similar between Dr. Khan and I, and what was different. There's the obvious ones. I'm an American, he's Sierra Leonean. We're both doctors, we were both treating Ebola patients. We both got sick treating Ebola patients. The difference is when Dr. Khan got sick, or he was taking care of people who had Ebola, it would sometimes take them days, if not longer, to get results back on their tests. For me, 3 hours. There was a lab right across the street that could tell me almost immediately that I had Ebola.
The people on Zoom, they can only see you when you're there in that region.
Ah, okay.
The camera is not working. Yeah, yes, thank you.
Hello, Zoom.
Thank you.
What else was different about Dr. Khan and I? Well, when I was being treated, I had access to a bunch of medicines. We didn't know if they worked, but I was offered brincidofovir. I was offered convalescent plasma, basically taking blood of a survivor and offering it to me with the hope that that would improve my condition. Dr. Khan did not have the same access. In fact, there was a dose of a potentially life-saving medicine called ZMapp, which was in the hospital, in the room next to where he was being cared for. He was not offered it. He was not told that it existed. This same medicine was 2 months later, when I was being treated for Ebola, offered to be flown from Winnipeg to my hospital in New York City. So the difference is not just about access. It's about agency and autonomy. And so I'm going to talk about those things, and I'm going to use Dr. Khan's story to highlight what's at stake. And it's not just Dr. Khan and I. If you look at the mortality rate of people who died of Ebola in West Africa during this outbreak, officially it's 40-something%. The likelihood is that it's actually probably higher, 50%. It's a coin flip. For the 11 people who were treated in the United States with Ebola, 9 of them survived. The only 2 who didn't were the only 2 who were not American citizens. There has long been this belief, particularly in people who do not get the same advantages from the global health system, that life and death decisions are often decided by the color of your passport. And that should not be. So I want to talk about that. What are the things that exist now? How can we understand and address them? And what do we need to be doing moving forward to make sure that these disparities don't continue? I want to talk about the deep roots of global health inequities. I am 1000% convinced if we don't think about what happened in the past and use it to inform the current and future policy, we will shoot ourselves in the foot over and over again and ask ourselves the questions, why can't we walk? This is what it looks like if you're responding to an Ebola outbreak. If you show up today in Uganda, if you show up today in Tanzania where there's a Marburg outbreak, you'll be presented with some version of this. This is how you biomedically respond to what is considered a biomedical threat. It makes perfect sense to me. Virus, no virus, people dead, we need to do surveillance, contact tracing, case management. This is pretty brilliant. And it's an approach that has helped us end every single Ebola outbreak. But some of them could have been ended a lot earlier. Whereas we, and by we I see Western medicine, people that often respond, see outbreaks like this, communities see them like this. What this is burial mounds for people who died in the 2014 Ebola outbreak in Guinea, close to where I was working. There are so many problems with this. The obvious one, there are no headstones. You have no idea who is in that plot of land, who's dead. Families cannot come and celebrate the legacy of their loved ones. You're thinking about places where there are national days of remembrance for family, and they're not able to see where their family's at. But these people are outside of their own communities. And there's a difference in the understanding of what happens with death with so many people in communities where we work in Guinea, and Liberia, and Sierra Leone. Whereas for us, your soul goes into heaven and your body goes into the ground. For so many of these communities, their family continues to live in the afterlife. And the afterlife is the most important. It influences what happens in your communities, whether your crops fail, whether you have 2 kids, 3 kids, 5 kids. And the most important thing about ensuring access to that afterlife for your loved ones is how you prepare them for burial. The rites that you do at that moment, not whether you lived a good life, not whether you donated your tithe, but what your family did in that last moment. And so here we took people out of their communities. We prevented their families from doing those most important rites, the most important things to guarantee their access to their ancestral homeland. And you can see a disconnect between what we saw as most important and what communities saw as most important. This is an image that probably smacks all of us as out of date, anachronistic, something that we don't support. This is a picture of a colonial sleeping sickness campaign just over 100 years ago. This is a colonial physician performing a lumbar puncture on a small kid to determine if they have sleeping sickness. Just as we see this and this different, many communities that we worked in West Africa didn't see a dramatic difference between this and this. There's a direct through line in terms of the people that are coming to help you, what they're bringing to help, and the agency, the autonomy, and the other issues that we bring with us. This is a paper looking at sleeping sickness campaigns in West Africa, East and Central Africa, just over 100 years ago. And if you get rid of sleeping sickness and put in the word Ebola and change the dates, it almost exactly describes the interventions, the global health interventions that we as an international community undertook to try to rid Ebola from West Africa. If we don't understand that background, if we do not incorporate that into our response, whether it's global health in response to Ebola in Guinea, or whether it is our own response here to domestic health issues in COVID, Mpox, et cetera, we will not succeed in our outcomes. So step one is we need to recognize the historical foundations of the work we do in health and really every other one of our pursuits. The other thing I want to talk about is improving access to critical health tools. These are 2 drugs. They're both treatments for Ebola virus disease. They can lower mortality, which is great. When you have an illness that causes 70 to 80% mortality, if you can drop that down to 30 to 40%, drop that risk of dying in half. That's incredible. It's not perfect and it's not great enough and we need new treatments. These are wonderful. They didn't exist 10 years ago. In that time period, there's been a lot of work, not just on Ebola, but on other infectious threats to try to reduce the morbidity and mortality. These are some successes. These are great. But I want to talk a little bit about this one on the right, Ebola MAB 114. This is a monoclonal antibody. Basically what this is like little antibodies that go around and find the virus, eat them up, and try to protect the body from worse infection and death. Both of these drugs have received FDA approval in 2020. There have been 5 Ebola outbreaks since then. Hundreds of patients. If you look at the number of patients who could have and should have had access to one of these life-saving drugs, and the number of them who actually received them, it's about 40%. Why is that the case? It's unfortunate, not just because it's a missed opportunity to save lives with a drug that we already have, but it's even worse when you hear the background. This is 1995, this is Kikwit. This is a very big outbreak of Ebola in the Congo. Went on over many months, many people died. It was one of the survivors of this outbreak that gave their blood as a way to be researched and used for further treatments and vaccines. And this MAB 114 came about exactly because one of these survivors gave their blood, gave their specimen, so that it could be used. In addition, the same communities where many of these outbreaks in the past 5 years have occurred were the ones responsible for hosting a trial, this PALM trial, which in 2019 showed the benefit of these 2 treatments. They helped put them together, they helped run them, they helped convince communities who have all these reasons that we just talked about to be skeptical, to allow these companies to come in, do these research trials, with the hope that they would benefit from these treatments. The National Institutes of Health, through its intramural research program, was responsible for helping put this together, and the United States put together $750 million of public funding. So these drugs, built on the blood of survivors, proven through the communities where Ebola outbreaks happen, with almost complete public funding support. And those drugs still remain inaccessible to the people that need them most. So what happened? One of those drugs, after it was proven to be efficacious, was basically given to a pharmaceutical company that is registered at a small building off the highway in Miami, Florida. It's owned by 2 people, basically private equity billionaires. And they had absolutely no distributive capacity, no manufacturing capacity, no history of research and development. But they now own a non-exclusive or an exclusive license to this treatment. And the result is that when outbreaks occur in places like Uganda, in the Congo, in Tanzania, where they're happening now, people have to go to places like this and beg for access to treatments. Unsurprisingly, they don't show up. That's because right now, almost all of them are held here in the United States Strategic National Stockpile. The Strategic National Stockpile you may have heard about during COVID was where we had gloves and PPE and ventilators. And it's basically this thing that was put together 2 decades ago in the event of a bioterrorist attack or some other health attack, that we'd have this big stockpile of stuff on the ready that we could disperse. And we have really important things. But we also have nearly all of the Ebola treatments that are available in the world in this one place. It makes it really hard then for me as a provider in an Ebola outbreak to say to people, come to an Ebola treatment center so I can offer you care. I can offer you a treatment, because that treatment doesn't exist. So we need to improve access, especially for a drug that was created completely by a community member with public funding. And there is precedent. So there are Ebola vaccines as well. I've been talking about the treatments, but there are vaccines. These vaccines work incredibly well. And just a few years ago, there was an effort to basically stockpile all these vaccines in Geneva, so that when there's an outbreak, a Ministry of Health can reach out to what is called the ICG and say, I need this many doses of vaccine. And the plan is to get them into that place within a week. Pretty remarkable. It's worked effectively well so far. We need the exact same thing for Ebola treatments. We need to create a stockpile of these medications so that they are available to the communities that help prove their efficacy and basically gave all of their effort to prove that they work. This is something that we've been working on, we've been advocating for, and I've been writing about. But it's not just Ebola. I don't want you to think that this is one thing that maybe you don't have to worry about. This issue is much bigger, and it will dramatically impact potentially all of us here. Recently, this is just months ago, this new medication called lenacapavir was heralded as the beginning of the end for HIV. That's awesome. We all want HIV to be over. This scourge that just over 40 years ago was first recognized now has treatments that turn it into a chronic illness for many people. The company that was responsible for putting it together, Gilead, has come out with all of these things basically saying it is nearly 100% efficacious in preventing new infections, meaning that if all of you took lenacapavir, which is an injection 2 times a year, that's it, and they're trialing it now 1 time a year, meaning potentially you could get a shot once a year, and your likelihood of getting HIV goes to 0. It's amazing, amazing. It is transformative, but only if you all can get that injection. It costs $44,000 in the United States. And Gilead kind of got out in front of what it knew was going to be a PR disaster if it didn't find a way to make sure that people in countries around the world were able to have access to it. And it said, we're going to make sure that 120 countries can have at-cost generic manufacturing for this medication. Sounds pretty good. But just like what happened with Ebola, where the communities and the people, the individuals that were responsible for proving the efficacy of it, here, Argentina, Peru, other middle-income countries that are kind of caught in between being wealthy enough to pay this high price tag and poor enough that they get free or relatively free access to these medications. They're stuck in between. So Argentina, Peru, Brazil, other countries, including other queer communities that were responsible for proving the efficacy of this, will not have access to this. Meaning that every single day, more and more people will continue to get HIV, despite this game changer, just because they were born in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's not just Ebola, it's not just HIV. If you all remember from COVID, it was incredible. I worked in a hospital. I saw more people die a day in New York City than I did in West Africa during Ebola. It was horrible. It was the apocalypse. And so when vaccines came out, I was ecstatic. But I knew exactly what was going to happen. I knew that we would have all the vaccines that we wanted with other places, and my friends around the world that were working in the same conditions would not have the same access. And so you can look at this map. And this is the share of the global population that's had at least 1 dose of a COVID vaccine. There are clear and obvious holes for places that didn't receive them. This is also a timeline looking at how these vaccine doses were administered over time throughout 2021, the countries and the places that they went. It was around this time that the US was buying up 2 to 3 doses per individual, getting in front of the line, and places that were trying to buy doses at the same time were told it would be 6, 9, 12 months, and were often forced to pay more per dose than we were in the US. And the result was that many places around the world did not get access to these essential vaccines for quite some time. There's been studies looking at this just in 2022. Global vaccine inequity, the inequitable access, the treatments that existed and were available, cost the lives of probably 1.5 million people, undoubtedly more since then. There was a study that was done in 2023 that I think most perfectly summarizes what the issue has been. In addition to the historical inequities, it's been a redoubling of the fact that the political economy is structured to improve and lengthen the lives of those in the global north, while neglecting and shortening the lives of those in the global south. Outside of just Ebola, Mpox, HIV, Ebola, HIV, and COVID. If you recall Mpox from a couple of years ago, you may have heard a lot about what was known as monkeypox, now known as Mpox. And you may have seen these kind of outbreak scenarios. And you may have heard about these big campaigns that happened in places like New York City and in Berlin and Montreal, where within weeks, we went from detecting first cases to rolling out vaccinations for communities, primarily men who have sex with men, who were most disproportionately targeted during this outbreak. That Mpox outbreak in the US is over, but the Mpox cases that started over 40 years ago and are currently on fire in places like DR Congo, Burundi, and others can't access the tools and the vaccines that they need, despite pledges by global institutions, by global governments. There have been over 5.3 million pledged doses. As of recently, there's been just a couple 100,000 that have been donated. But it's not all doom and gloom, so worry not. There is some hope. A lot of places have realized that maybe we can't rely on traditional partners to save us during crises. There is in Rwanda now, in the capital, an mRNA vaccination, so the same platform that was used for COVID shots. There is a vaccination production facility underway that's being created that's going to start making vaccines for the African continent. 99% of all vaccinations that are needed in Africa are provided from outside Africa. Less than 1% are made on the continent today. And the African Union has said, by 2040, we want 60% of those to be made here. It's ambitious. It's critical. It's important. We see that the World Health Organization and others have put together these initiatives to try and support communities and scientific communities to build the technology necessary to build these tools in places where they are needed. In 2022, Johnson & Johnson was creating one of its vaccines and had contracted with a facility in South Africa to fill and finish, meaning basically taking bulk vaccine, send it to South Africa where it was put in bottles, make sure it was sterilized. And at the same time that South Africa was just afire with COVID vaccines and waiting in line for its own, it was forced to export those doses to European countries, despite finishing them and filling them there in South Africa. And so now there are in over 12 countries around the world, identified facilities where countries have said, we're not going to rely on the outside world. We're going to do this ourselves. Sounds great, but it's going to be really difficult. It's going to be very hard. Because right now you have large pharmaceutical companies that are able to charge less. You have generic manufacturing in places like India, which has been built up over the last 50 years, that is able to provide animal and human vaccine doses at just a fraction of the cost of many others, which is wonderful, which is great. But that then forces millions and millions of people to rely on outsiders for their own assistance. Why should you care? I know you probably tried to forget the last 5 years, and I think the last election was like all about COVID, but no one ever pretended that it was about COVID. I know we don't want to talk about COVID, no one cares about COVID. But I think COVID showed one of the reasons why we need to care. Even if global vaccine inequities did not impact you directly, they impacted all of us. So we know that uninterrupted spread of COVID and other viruses allows them to mutate. We're seeing right now what's happening with H5N1 in this country. We're seeing bird flu as it continues to spread, and it could be potentially disastrous. Without acting, without putting in place equitable solutions, we put ourselves more at risk. So the Delta variant was first detected in India, caused probably 4 million deaths there, and then ultimately was one of the variants that made us realize that despite the best efforts of our vaccines, they may not be completely impenetrable to new variants. Omicron in November of 2021 was kind of the death blow in many respects to the protection that we had hoped the vaccines would offer us, or at least been told they would offer us. And the result also with Omicron was that you had a global community. And I knew exactly what happened. I remember this was the day after Thanksgiving, that the South African community, South Africa and Southern African countries, all came out and said, there is this new variant, we should all prepare. And instead of being applauded and saying, thank you for your scientific prowess and your transparency, the one thing that the global community did was close its doors. And said those 9 countries of Southern Africa were not allowed to travel. We're not allowed to come to the United States. We're not allowed to come to Western Europe. It was a travel ban that was taking place. The result was that ultimately Omicron was brought into Africa more times than it was exported from the continent, which is bananas. When this travel ban went into place, just a day after Omicron was reported, there were also cases detected in Belgium and the United Kingdom at the same time. But there was no travel ban put in place for either of those countries. And you say, why does it matter? There was a lot of inefficiencies and things that didn't make sense about the pandemic. It matters because for countries right now who are determining whether or not they should be transparent about what's happening with health in their countries, about outbreaks that are happening right now, of which there are many, there is zero incentive for transparency. If the global community is going to punish you every time you do the right thing, well, then you're going to stop doing the right thing. And so we've set ourselves up for a scenario in which we are less safe now in many respects than we were 5 years ago. We are more vulnerable to international health threats, infectious threats, because there is no desire and there's no appetite for transparency amongst many countries. Couple that with the fact that many countries now have much greater laboratory capacity. You're going to hear there's a lot more Ebola outbreaks. We've had Ebola, we've got Marburg, we've had many of these recently. I don't think it's because we're having that much more of them. I think for some of them, we are. But it's because countries have the skills and the capacity to detect them more frequently. What is going to happen when those become bigger, more widespread, but countries are incentivized to say nothing or to try to downplay it? And we can say that this is something that only countries out there do, but this is what the US has done over the past year when it comes to birth rates. So we need to think about how this matters and why this matters for us. It is the first few weeks really of an outbreak that can determine the difference between containment and chaos. If we don't have access during that time, if we don't have reliable and transparent data, then we're not going to be able to intervene in the right way, and it's going to put us all at risk. I talked about Mpox and how we were lucky to end the outbreak here in the United States. Vaccination campaigns were rolled out, they were effective, and we said, okay, well, it's back over there now, we don't have to worry so much about it. We'll promise some doses, but we'll get to them when we want. Does anyone know when this is from? What's the date today? Yeah, this is clade 1b. Maybe like, I don't know what the hell's clade 1b. The clade, the kind of variant that was responsible of Mpox for the outbreak that we dealt with a couple years ago, was one that primarily infected communities of men who have sex with men. Did not seem very lethal. It was not fun. It was not convenient, and it was really bad. But it didn't really kill people. Clade 1b is a different variant. This is a variant that is more responsible for spread amongst kids. It seems to have different transmission, not sexual transmission, and has been responsible for many, many deaths. And so now, because of our inability to contain this where it was raging, we now have cases of clade 1b here in our own state. I mentioned this already. This, if you look, this is also from yesterday. There's an Ebola outbreak in Uganda. The number of cases appears to be around 9. There's not a whole lot of transparency as there has been in the past, with good reason. If I was Uganda, I wouldn't be fully transparent either. I would be trying to keep myself off this administration's radar, because the thing that comes next are travel bans and other stigmatizing actions that only make things worse. But as I mentioned earlier, if I don't have access, or if I can't promise something to people who are sick with a disease like Ebola, and I cannot say to them, I'm able to provide you treatment, I'm able to help you, then the likelihood that they will come for help is lower. The likelihood that they will continue to spread that is higher. The likelihood that that will create more of a countrywide, a regional, potentially a global outbreak is dramatically higher. The difference here is that unlike the vaccines and treatments that we have for Ebola virus disease, Zaire strain, this is an outbreak of the Sudan strain of Ebola virus, very different than the one that caused the outbreak a decade ago. There are no treatments for this, there are no vaccines for this. Thankfully, Uganda learned from 2 years ago when it had a similar outbreak, and the global community wasn't fast enough to respond. They said, you know what we're gonna do? We're gonna put in place our own protocols. We're gonna work with our own partners. And they created a research protocol that was ready the day an outbreak was declared. 3 days later, they were doing a vaccine trial. This is great. We are responsive. We are so grateful because they're doing the work that may eventually end up keeping us safe. The problem is that we're not contributing to it. So my good friends who all work at the CDC or at USAID that should be there right now, who would be in Uganda, are not there. They can't talk to their colleagues. They can't talk to WHO colleagues. We can't disperse. We're still trying to figure out how to disperse the right equipment and money to help with the outbreak. Normally, USAID would be the implementing partner responsible for border screening at the airport. They would fund that and they would help set that up along with CDC. That didn't happen. Thankfully, the World Health Organization was willing to do that, use its own funds and its own people. But with increasing outbreaks in many places, in a World Health Organization that has fewer people and fewer funds, it's not going to be able to keep doing that. Again, putting this at risk. If you haven't heard about the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, this is probably the most successful global health intervention ever. Started by George Bush 22 years ago. It has saved 25 million lives. Absolutely incredible. Unbelievable in terms of its impact. It has turned HIV into a chronic disease for over 20 million people around the world. It has prevented the maternal child transmission of HIV millions and millions and millions of times. And as of a week ago, all of its funding was stopped, and people were showing up to clinics in many places to get their medication and being told that they were no longer getting it and it would no longer be able to be provided. People were being laid off from these programs. And the result is, probably starting next week, maybe the week after, people who for decades have had an undetectable viral load, meaning that their HIV was so low they could not transmit it to anyone, will start being able to infect other people. People will start getting sick. More babies will be born with HIV for the rest of their life. And it's all because of a quick decision to turn off a program that has arguably very strongly been one of the best global health interventions that the US has ever done. Now, I just have like 1 more minute, and I'm going to say, okay, I talked about a lot of things that didn't go great. Let's talk about what happens when you do things right. Has anyone heard of the Marburg virus disease outbreak in Rwanda? That's great. You know why you haven't heard about it? Because Rwanda did a hell of a job taking care of it all by themselves. 30 years ago, Rwanda was mired in genocide. The country had no health system. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people had been killed. People had crossed over into Zaire, now DR Congo. It had no health system. In 30 years, in 3 decades, with international partners, including the United States, they've rebuilt a health system that is incredibly strong and resilient. One of my best friends was working in the hospital where Marburg virus, so this is the exact same thing, the exact same as Ebola, where this was detected. She called me 3 days before the official announcement and said, Craig, I think that there's Ebola here. She told me about it. I said, okay, let's see what we can do. It was found out to be Marburg. I ended up speaking to some other people and at the White House who within 24 hours were sending investigational vaccines and investigational treatments that landed in Rwanda within 7 days. My friend was vaccinated against Marburg virus disease, never got sick. She was providing treatments to her colleagues who survived. Rwanda has had the lowest mortality ever recorded for an outbreak of a viral hemorrhagic fever. This is a lower middle income country, very, very different than our own, but it's proven to be resilient and it's proven that with the right inputs and the right support, you can provide equitable care, quality care, impactful care that is so good that none of you have to read about it on the front page of the New York Times. That is the importance of these investments. And so as I think, coming back to Dr. Khan's story, Dr. Khan and I, as I mentioned, we're very similar. We both had Ebola. We both were doctors. We were both working in West Africa. We were different in so many ways. I had access to so many things that he could never imagine, despite the fact that they were just on the other side of the door in the hospital where he was sleeping. I think he shows what the stakes are. In the past decade, we have learned a lot. We've gotten better at outbreaks. We've seen the impact of inequitable distribution of treatments and vaccines have had in COVID, in Mpox, in Ebola. We've seen what the stakes are. The stakes are losing people like Dr. Khan, a national hero in places like Sierra Leone. And unfortunately, we have entirely too few people like this that are willing to put themselves on the line. So we need to do everything we can to protect them. With that, I will take some questions. We just take some questions? All right. Anyone have any questions? Don't be shy. I'm gonna start back there and I'll come to you. Yes. Scream it nice and loud.
I hope it's not too forward, but.
It's okay. I've heard it all.
Ebola like?
I would not recommend it. Do whatever you can to prevent it. Have you ever been really sick and thought you were gonna die and it had like a 70% chance of dying? It's like that.
Appreciate it.
So, I mean, look, this was the whole point. My whole story was about the fact that I lived in relative luxury for 19 days. I had climate-controlled conditions. I had a security camera that I could watch, people walking in and walking out. You know, I had some entertainment. I had Wi-Fi, I had great nursing, and it still really sucked. But at the same time, I was providing care for 30 to 40 people every single day, and there were probably 30 people taking care of me every day. My situation was horrible, and it was the best case scenario. So the people that I took care of in Guinea, I don't know how I got infected. If I had to guess, it was probably one of the last days that I was there taking care of a woman who was undoubtedly going to die. Like we all knew that she was going to die. And she kept vomiting and having diarrhea, vomiting and having diarrhea. And repeatedly we cleaned her. And our goal was to give her some sense of humanity. When she died, she wouldn't be in her own vomit and in her own feces. And that was a repetitive process that we did probably 10 times. So despite how bad my experience was, it is not even comparable to what it was like for 99.99% of people that had to go through this. Yeah.
What do you think is the path forward for these organizations that are trying to prevent disease outbreaks, considering the current administration's attitudes towards vaccines?
It's not a good moment. Like equity is a dirty word. And it's not just a global health issue. Like if you look at National Science Foundation, NSF funding, words that are being targeted for potentially cutting funding are things like equity, disability, women, feminine. I think we have come very, very far in our national conversation and this consciousness of understanding that inequitable outcomes are built into much of our society, are built into our healthcare structures, are built into global health framework. I have some optimism that at this point, a lot of places are going to say, oh, all those things that you said for us, you never really meant for us, and that we're going to have to fix those problems ourselves. And so will there be foundations that step up to support this work? Yes. Is it going to be sufficient to build vaccine manufacturing across the African continent? No. Is it going to make a dent? Yes. Will it prove the case that this is what needed to happen and that maybe sometimes some of our strongest partners are not going to be there and that we need to think about how we stand on our own? Yeah. I think it's a long process and I think it's an unfortunate process that hurts us both from a health perspective, from a national security, foreign policy perspective. But I hope that looking back in 20 years, someone says, you know, this was a moment that really kickstarted a lot of people to think differently about how to protect themselves and how to protect others. Yes, all the way back there.
So much for the presentation. My question is, what is your take on the possibility of scaling up traditional medicines, particularly coming from Africa, to handle some of these problems that we have? Do you think actually is potential. If somebody out there can invest in packaging the traditional medicine in a certain way and fitting.
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you didn't hear, the question was around traditional medicines. It's interesting how I showed those graph of the algorithm of how we manage Ebola versus how Ebola is seen from the bottom up. We think about Western biomedicine, and anything that isn't that we call alternative, right? But if you think about, if you go anywhere in the world today that has malaria, you will be asked to take an anti-malarial if you get malaria. That comes from the tree, the artemisinin tree, which was an old Chinese treatment. We know many malaria and other treatments are based off traditional remedies. There are a lot of things that exist. Is there a process by which people are right now looking into those? Yes, I met someone a few weeks ago who was using artificial intelligence to look at traditional medicine to determine which one of these could be efficacious and scaled, and then ultimately impact communities that were responsible for this knowledge creation. So yes, do I think that it's going to like full-fledged recreate the pharmaceutical availability? No. Do I think knowing stories about the fact that like Congolese communities who gave their own blood, gave their time, gave their money, gave their resources, should rightfully be angry about not having access to the fruits of those labors? Like, I think we need to tell that story a lot more. And I think even people that don't care about equity, even people that don't like care about global health are going to say, yeah, that's pretty effed up. Like, that's not cool, right? And I think if we tell that story and make people realize that, that is one inroad to try to expand access to these things that exist and think about how we improve access to things that will exist in the future, including traditional remedies.
Actually, I believe that one medication that has been underrated because it has been used in many countries. I personally used it during COVID. And I had people, someone used to give me, I used to sell it. I've had people who actually would buy for their relatives coming even as far as
Yeah.
because it was actually tested in South Africa for SARS-CoV. They discovered that it would actually do SARS-CoV.
Yeah.
So I would actually say maybe we also need to look at countries coming up with their own solution.
Absolutely.
Solutions to such problems.
Absolutely. Yep. Completely agree. I think we have, if I answer them quickly, time for 2 more questions. Are there 2 more hands? I have 1 more hand and I have 1 more hand. If you want to tell me your question, and then I'll come here and I'll try to get them, I'll be pithy.
I just have a quick question. Now with Argentina and the US exiting the World Health Organization, like how do you see like this whole development there?
Yeah.
So like,
Okay, great.
In the role of the UN, I mean, the role has it failed? I mean,
Yeah.
the global community, what is the role? How to step up?
Yeah.
What other role to play then?
Yeah. So if you haven't heard, the United States has signaled that it wants to pull out of the World Health Organization, an organization that's been around since 1948, that it helped establish, that it supported to about 25% of its operating budget. So losing it as a member would be problematic. The UN, the WHO, other transnational partners, so health organizations that work across borders. How we'll decide this will be, it will be disastrous. I promise you, I stand on this ground right now. I will promise you with 100% certainty that we will regret this. I don't know if it's a week from now. I don't know if it's a month from now. I don't know if it's a year from now. Absolutely will regret this. What does this mean if we don't? The WHO sets up GHSIS. Basically, what that does is a global health influenza monitoring survey. It finds out what's happening with flu all over the world and puts it together in a nice little package and says, this is how you should make your flu vaccine next year. The US is not part of that anymore. So on the scale of just like influenza vaccine, it's okay, whatever. I don't care about influenza vaccine, you may say. It means that like all of those other things that WHO has been responsible for, WHO has problems. We all have problems. USAID has problems. It doesn't mean we need to get rid of them. We need to improve them. Getting rid of them, I assure you, will mean we have fewer eyes on what's happening in places. Getting rid of CDC in relationship to WHO means we will have fewer eyes early enough in outbreaks to stop them. It will impact us here. There is 0% chance we can build a wall tall enough to keep infectious threats out. It's not going to happen. At the same time, we're undermining, I think, our ability to respond to threats internally. And so I think one of either of these individually would be really bad. Both of them together is a recipe for disaster. And that's not me saying, warning, warning, breaking news. It's me saying that we've done this before. We did this in 2017 and 2018, got rid of the Office of Pandemic Preparedness, underfunded surveillance and all these other kind of global health security instruments. And we were remarkably flat-footed for COVID. And I think we'll be even worse off potentially for the next whatever it is.
We have one question online. Firstly, thank you for the presentation and recognizing your wondrous great work in people health. I want to ask earlier in the HIV/AIDS pandemic, Brazil, South Africa, and India wanted to produce generic drugs,
Yes.
but reports seem to highlight how this would affect the industries in the global north because it would reduce their market.
Yes.
Could there be a parallel case with other alternatives?
Yes. So in 2020, India and South Africa went to the World Trade Organization and said, we need to have a TRIPS waiver, trade-related intellectual property, basically saying there are companies that own the solution, that own the recipe to create drugs or treatments or diagnostics to end an outbreak, to provide treatment. We can create those. All we need is the recipe. And countries, including the United States and many others, said, no, we need to keep these intellectual property rights in place. We need to encourage pharmaceuticals, diagnostic companies to have some return on investment. I agree, and ultimately the United States came on board, but it was too late. There needs to be a process that during global health threats, pandemics, there needs to be a waiver on things like intellectual property so that generic manufacturers are able to create treatments, vaccines, that diagnostic tests can be made by groups other than those that may own the rights to it. I think that from a global health solidarity, but also from a global health security standpoint, there needs to be a reconsideration of things like TRIP waivers, which have been a discussion not just for COVID, but not just for HIV, but for decades.